Bad lettering can make good comics look like trash. Lettering has this huge impact on comics, but it's often overlooked. Luckily, with a few simple guidelines, we can make any comic look a little bit more professional and, more importantly, make the comic easier to read. Hey, Walter here with a how-to webtoon and comics, and today we're talking about one of my favorite topics, lettering. I love lettering because it is a subtle art form, but it does have some basic tenets that are easier to show, explain, critique, and understand, more so than some of the more ethereal interpretive theories around art and comics. Now, I want to stress that lettering is an art and therefore open to interpretation. I might say rule, has to, do, don't, never, always, but just like with any rule around art, it is not a law. Watch the video, learn the guidelines, and flavor to taste. There are a ton of fonts on the internet, and narrowing it down to just one can be super tough. I simplify my life by using blandbot.com. The owner of the site is a professional letterer and has made all of the fonts on the site. Even better, there are a ton of free fonts, and it feels like over half the fonts are free to independent creators like me. And now there are paid fonts, but they are reasonably priced around 20 to 25 bucks. And there is an assortment of dialogue, design, and effect fonts. I love his effect fonts. My main dialogue fonts are Smack Attack and Out of Line, and my favorite design font right now is Trash Cinema. You've probably seen me overusing it on all of my YouTube videos. Another reason I like the Blandbot fonts is because I know the licensing agreement and I know I am free to use them. If you find some random font online that you like and you don't know the agreement, you are opening yourself up to some legal issues. Now, it's unlikely for a small comic, but there's the potential, so why open yourself up to the risk? Knowledge bit number 2, choosing a font. When you choose a font, remember it is all about readability. Don't pick a cool font that is hard to read. Even if you have like an evil or demonic character where it might make sense to get a jagged, rough font and put it on top of a black background instead of a white background, just remember that it's gonna affect readability. For example, if you choose like a dark red color for your jagged font and then put that on top of a black balloon, it's gonna have less contrast and therefore be harder to read. Now, if you stick to most of the Blandbot dialogue fonts for your dialogue, you should be fine. But if you pick like an effect or a design font and use that for dialogue, it's gonna get a little sketchy. So just make sure you can read that font at print size. And speaking of, knowledge bit number 3, choosing the font size. Now, I've said this many times, but the font size you need is going to depend a lot on your canvas size, your resolution, and even the font itself. Not all 12-point fonts are created equal. The easiest way to figure out the font size you need is by using Professional Comics as a guide. You take your comic page, go find a professional comic page, copy it, paste it over your comic page, and increase the size or decrease the size depending on the size of your comic, so that the pro page fits within your page. Now get your font and type the same dialogue over the pro page's font. Now adjust the settings of your font until it matches the sizing of the professional page. If it's good enough for their 10,000 copies, it's probably good enough for our smaller print runs. Now, there is more to sizing than just the font size. There are 2 other settings that I mess around with. The first is leading. This is the amount of space between the lines of a comic. It is best to set this manually to optimize space usage. The setting that comes defaulted works and it's easy to read, but you're leaving a lot of space between the lines. And then the second is tracking. This is the space between letters. You want to get these 2 settings as small as possible without affecting readability. Knowledge bit number 4, formatting the text. Now, this is a big one for me. The formatting or the shape of the text should use up the least amount of space as possible. It needs to be nice and tight. Now, depending on what you're working with as far as the panel and the art are concerned, you might have to change the shape to be longer or taller, but usually I try to get this nice, like consistent, like oblong oval shape. Knowledge bit number 5, balloon shape. Just like people, balloon shapes come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes, so you kind of have to pick your favorite one and decide which one you think looks best for your comic. This is the balloon shape I use. It's kind of this oblong circular shape. It's what I grew up with American comics. I do see a lot of people using these perfect circle oval balloons. It's pretty common in manga. Totally fine. It doesn't really matter. You could use rectangles if you wanted to. It all comes down to what you think looks good and hopefully what's taking up the least amount of room, because you don't want to cover up your art. Another thing you might want to do is vary the line weight around the balloon. It gives it a little bit more life. It looks a little bit less digital. Depending on what program you use, this might be easier or harder. Like if you have Clip Studio, you can do this. If you have Photoshop, you could do it with layer styles using stroke, drop shadow, and inner shadow. Within a comic, I like to keep all the balloons the same shape, the same line width. The tails should all look fairly similar, with exceptions of course, like for yelling or monsters or whatever. I prefer to keep my balloons as vectors because I can resize them without any loss in quality. If you hand draw them, even super high res, and you start transforming them, you might get some weird artifacting, or it might look blurry, which is going to make your comic look pretty poopy. These were the balloons I used for my first 2 graphic novels. They're these like jagged balloons. I thought they kind of fit my art style and they didn't waste too much space, but honestly I used them because I didn't want to take the time to figure out how to make a traditional balloon. So I did each of these by hand, which seemed quicker at the time, but was probably longer. So for my Webtoon Haxer, I used the same one balloon over and over. I just kept resizing it as needed for the dialogue. In retrospect, I should have had probably at least 2 or more similar balloons, just slightly different, so that my comic didn't look as stagnant and there was some movement with the lettering. Speaking about movement, knowledge bit number 6 is placement. Now placement is all about readability, also reader flow. You want the progression of the reading order to feel natural to the reader. There shouldn't be a moment where the reader has to stop and guess what to read next. Try to step back and read your own page. Let your eye guide your reading order and not your knowledge of the script. Is the reading order easy to read and understand? It's tradition to keep the balloons on the same side as the characters if there are 2 or more characters in the panel. This just helps the reader know who's saying what without having to follow the balloons before reading. So if Spiky is on the left of the panel and Man Bun is on the right, we can assume the first panel on the left is being spoken by Spiky. But if we get to the bottom of the dialogue and we see that it was Man Bun saying it the whole time. This is also the reason we don't like crossing tails of the balloon, because it can cause confusion. Now it could be hard to keep the balloons on the same side as the character who's speaking, but that is why we do layouts, to find these potential problems early and adjust the layouts as needed. So check out my layout video if you want more information on how to do that. If you need to force a reading pattern that might not be natural, you can overlap balloons. It's a detour that the reader must follow. This is also a good method for handling uncertain panel orders as well. If you'd like a little bit more information about lettering, I did a top 5 mistakes of lettering video that goes into a little bit more detail about this, and then some other traditional aspects of lettering. And remember, these videos are all about giving a little bit of insight into some of the more technical details about making webtoons and comics. But at the end of the day, it's all about what you think looks best and what makes you happy. So do what you want. So now before we leave, I have a question for you guys. What do you think about the outro I've been doing about link, like, blah, 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 blah. I'm not sure how I feel about it. Is it obnoxious? What do you think about it? How about something like, it's art, do what you want, or that's it, the end?